The city was alive with movement, shining lights reflecting off glass towers and busy streets. In one of those tall buildings sat a man whose name was well known in the business world. His face often appeared in newspapers, his speeches carried weight, and his decisions changed the direction of entire industries. He was a millionaire CEO, a man who seemed untouchable in the eyes of many. Success surrounded him, and people often looked at him as if he had everything one could ever want. But behind the glass doors of his office and the confident smile he wore in public, there were small, almost invisible cracks forming in his life. These cracks did not appear in his company or in his wealth, they appeared in his health. It started quietly. A slight fatigue after meetings, a soreness in his legs he brushed off as nothing more than long work hours. He was a man who believed in pushing himself. To him, success was built on sacrifice, and if his body ached a little, he saw it as proof of his hard work. He would tell himself, "It's nothing. Just tiredness. A little rest and I'll be fine." Days turned into weeks and the small irritations began to grow. Red marks formed on his leg, itchy and painful at times. At first he ignored them. He told himself it was probably an allergy, something that would disappear on its own. He used quick creams that he bought from the pharmacy, never giving it much thought. After all, he had meetings to attend, deals to sign, and flights to catch. His staff noticed his discomfort but never said a word. He was their boss, their leader. How could they question him? If he rubbed his leg under the table during a meeting or winced slightly when standing, they looked away politely. His friends were too busy admiring his success to notice the tired look in his eyes. His doctors gave him routine checkups but only touched the surface. They were used to patients rushing in and out, and he, always pressed for time, never explained much. Life went on. The world kept celebrating his achievements while he quietly carried the weight of something he refused to face. He was a man surrounded by people, yet in truth he was alone with his growing pain. Then came the night in the hotel. He was staying in a luxury suite, the kind of place that overlooked mountains and valleys. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The glass windows framed a view that could take anyone's breath away. Inside, the furniture was polished, the air smelled fresh, and the room looked like the kind of comfort only wealth could buy. But on that evening, he sat on the edge of the sofa, his shirt sleeves rolled up, staring at his leg. The red marks had turned into swollen patches, raw and painful. He held a bottle of cream in one hand, trying to apply it, but the discomfort was too much. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel fear. He asked himself, "Why is this not going away? Why does it keep spreading?" But even then, his pride told him it was nothing serious. Pride can be a dangerous thing. It whispers that asking for help is weakness, that admitting pain makes you less than what people believe you to be. He was a man who had built an empire, and in his mind, how could something as small as a skin irritation defeat him? The silence of the room pressed down on him as he tried to ignore the truth. His phone buzzed with emails and messages from people who depended on him. Business never stopped, and neither could he. So he sat there, putting on the same mask he always wore, calm, controlled, in charge. But the truth was clear to anyone who dared to look closely. His health was slipping, and he was blind to it. And then life brought in someone unexpected. A knock came at the door, followed by the entrance of the hotel maid. She was there to deliver fresh towels and tidy up the room, just as she did for countless guests every day. Her uniform was simple. Her hands carried the work of long hours, and her presence was something most guests barely noticed. But she had eyes that saw more than most people realized. She stepped in, polite and professional, but as her eyes scanned the room, they landed on the sight of him sitting there with his leg exposed. She froze for a moment, her gaze lingering on the angry red marks climbing up his skin. She had seen things like this before, in her own family and among neighbors who did not always have access to proper health care. To her, it was not just a passing rash. It was something that demanded attention. The CEO noticed her pause and gave a small smile, the kind of polite smile he used when he wanted people not to ask questions. He quickly pulled the cream bottle higher, as if to show he was already handling it. But inside, the maid felt a stir of worry. Something in her heart told her this was more serious than he believed. She saw a man everyone admired, yet at that moment he looked vulnerable, human, even fragile. For now, she said nothing. She placed the towels down neatly, nodded politely, and stepped out. But her mind did not forget what she had seen. That night, as the city outside glowed with lights, two lives moved closer together in ways neither of them yet understood. On one side, a man surrounded by everything yet trapped in silence. On the other, a woman overlooked by the world but carrying within her the courage to notice what others ignored. The story of how their paths crossed would soon prove that sometimes salvation does not come from doctors or riches, but from the quiet courage of someone willing to care. The next morning began like any other for the maid. She tied her apron neatly, adjusted her uniform, and picked up her cart filled with towels, fresh linens, and cleaning supplies. She had learned over the years that people rarely noticed her presence. Guests often walked past her as if she were invisible, lost in their own worlds of business, vacation, or personal troubles. But she had also learned something else. Sometimes being unnoticed gave her the ability to observe what others could not. Her job required attention to detail. A misplaced glass, a wrinkle in the bedsheet, or a stain on the carpet, nothing escaped her eyes. But her attention went beyond furniture and rooms. She noticed people too. She noticed when a guest's smile looked forced, when someone's eyes seemed tired, or when a voice carried a weight of sadness. Working in silence, she had become a quiet witness to human lives, each one carrying a story that passed briefly through the hotel's walls. That morning, as she pushed her cart down the hallway, her mind kept drifting back to the image of the man she had seen the previous evening, the Millionaire CEO. He had looked so polished on the surface, dressed in expensive clothes, surrounded by luxury. Yet what caught her eye was not his wealth, but the pain he tried to hide. Those angry red marks on his leg told her a story, one that others had either missed or chosen to ignore. She had seen something similar before. Years ago, her younger brother had developed strange marks on his skin that everyone thought were harmless. The family had ignored it at first, thinking it was an allergy or insect bites. By the time they realized it was a serious infection, it had spread dangerously. That memory stayed with her, etched in her heart as a reminder of how quickly small symptoms could grow into something life-threatening. So when she saw the CEO's leg, she knew deep inside that silence could be costly. But what could she do? She was just a maid, a woman whose job was to clean rooms and serve quietly in the background. Would a man of his stature even take her words seriously? The thought filled her with doubt. Fear whispered that speaking up might cost her the job she depended on, yet something stronger than fear spoke within her. Compassion. She thought about how lonely he had looked, even surrounded by wealth. His eyes had not carried the joy of a man who had everything. Instead, they carried the burden of someone fighting a silent battle. And she knew battles like that could only be won when someone dared to intervene. Later that day, she knocked on his door again. This time, she came with her usual supplies, her hands steady though her heart raced. He invited her in with the same polite tone, distracted as he glanced at his laptop. Business was still on his mind, but she noticed the way he shifted uncomfortably. His leg stretched out as though it pained him. As she worked quietly in the room, she wrestled with the words in her mind. How should she say it? How could she speak in a way that he would understand she meant no disrespect? Finally, as she placed fresh towels on the rack, she turned toward him and spoke softly. "Sir," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "I could not help but notice the marks on your leg yesterday. Please forgive me for saying this, but it does not look like something simple. My brother once had something similar, and it became serious very quickly. I think you should see a doctor." The room fell silent. The CEO looked up, surprised. Few people ever dared to address him so directly, let alone a hotel maid. For a moment he felt a rush of pride, the instinct to dismiss her words. After all, he had wealth, access to the best doctors, and his own judgment. Why should he listen to someone who cleaned rooms? But then he caught the look in her eyes. It was not the look of someone trying to lecture him or invade his privacy. It was the look of genuine concern, the kind he had not seen in a long time. It reminded him of his mother's eyes when she used to worry about him as a child. Something about that sincerity made it difficult to brush her words aside. He forced a smile and said, "It's nothing serious, just a small irritation. I've been using cream for it." She hesitated but did not back down. "Sometimes what looks small is not small at all," she replied gently. "Please, I only say this because I have seen what can happen. Maybe it is nothing, but maybe it is more. If you see a doctor now, you will know for sure." Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room. The CEO sat in silence, staring at his leg. A part of him still wanted to believe it was nothing. He had important work to do, deals to finalize. But another part of him, a part that had been ignored for too long, whispered that she might be right. That night he found himself unable to sleep. Her words replayed in his mind, mixing with the growing discomfort in his leg. For the first time he admitted to himself that he was afraid. Afraid not of losing money or power, but of losing something far more precious, his health, his life. What struck him most was not just her observation, but her courage. She had nothing to gain by speaking up, yet she risked her own job to tell him the truth. It made him realize how rare it was for people around him to speak honestly. His staff, his colleagues, even his friends, they were all careful with their words, afraid to offend or disturb the image he carried. But this Maid, a woman the world overlooked, had given him something priceless: honesty born from compassion. The next morning, he made a decision. For the first time in weeks, he canceled a meeting. Instead, he called his personal physician and asked for a detailed checkup. He could still hear the maid's words in his mind as he spoke on the phone. Sometimes what looks small is not small at all. That single act, driven by a stranger's courage, would soon uncover a truth that would change his life forever. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the hotel room, spilling golden light across the floor. The CEO sat quietly on the sofa, staring at the unopened folders on the table in front of him. He had always been a man who never let a single day go to waste, always filling his hours with meetings, phone calls, and travel. Yet that morning his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the maid's words, about the way she had looked at him with genuine concern. It was strange how her voice echoed louder in his memory than the voices of the countless executives and advisors who surrounded him daily. For years, he had lived with the belief that power came from silence, from showing no weakness. He had built an empire on that image, strong, untouchable, never faltering. But now, as he shifted his leg and felt the sharp sting of pain spread through it, he realized how fragile he truly was. He looked at the angry red patches spreading wider than before, and fear took hold of him in a way he had not felt since his youth. Fear was not an emotion he allowed himself to admit. In boardrooms, he carried himself like a lion, decisive and unshakable. At public events, he wore confidence like a perfectly tailored suit. Even in his private life, he rarely let anyone see him uncertain. But this fear was different. It was not about losing money or reputation or control. It was about something much more basic, his body failing him. He thought about the maid again, a woman the world would call ordinary. She cleaned rooms, changed sheets, and delivered towels. Yet she had shown more courage in those few words than many people in his life had ever dared. She had no reason to care about him, no benefit to gain, and yet she spoke because she saw what others ignored. That kind of courage stirred something deep in him, something he had long buried under layers of pride. For hours he debated what to do. He told himself that he could wait, that it would pass, that the creams and ointments would eventually work. But each time he tried to convince himself, the memory of her soft but firm words came back. Sometimes what looks small is not small at all. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip, he picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen as if dialing his doctor was the hardest decision he had ever made. But eventually he pressed the numbers and requested an urgent appointment. It was a small act, but to him it felt monumental. For the first time in a long time, he admitted he could not handle everything alone. The doctor's office was quiet and professional, the kind of place where money ensured swift service. He sat in the examination room, the sterile white walls pressing in on him as he waited. When the doctor entered and began to examine his leg, he could see the shift in the man's expression. The easy smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. Tests were ordered immediately, blood samples taken, scans arranged. The CEO tried to keep his composure, but inside his thoughts raced. What if the maid had been right? What if this was not a simple irritation? The idea unsettled him more than any business failure ever had. Because money could rebuild a company, but it could not rebuild a failing body. When the results came in, the doctor spoke carefully. The infection was severe, more complicated than he had imagined, and had been spreading silently. If left untreated much longer, it could have caused life-threatening complications. The words hit him harder than any loss on the stock market ever had. For once, he was not in control, and the reality of his own mortality sat heavy on his chest. On the ride back to the hotel, he stared out the window in silence. The city lights blurred past, but all he could think about was the quiet courage of the woman who had noticed what everyone else ignored. If she had not spoken, if he had continued brushing it off, the story might have ended very differently. Back in his suite, he sat down and reflected. For so long he had been surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. His wealth and power had created a wall that few dared to cross. Everyone respected him, but no one truly saw him, not as a man but as a human being who could suffer and break. Yet a maid, someone society often overlooked, had broken through that wall with nothing more than honesty and care. That realization humbled him. It made him question the very foundation of his life. What was the point of all his success if he ignored the small truths that could save him? What good was being a leader if he could not even acknowledge his own vulnerability? He thought of his own employees. How many times they might have struggled in silence, afraid to speak up because of the power he held over them. He realized then that true courage did not come from building empires, but from speaking when silence was easier. The maid's courage had saved his life. But more than that, it had awakened something inside him that he had long forgotten, the ability to listen, to see beyond appearances and to recognize that even the smallest voices could carry the greatest wisdom. That night, he slept with a strange peace. The pain in his leg remained. The treatment ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in weeks he felt hope. Not because of the medicine alone, but because of the lesson he had learned. Courage could come from anywhere. And sometimes it arrived in the quiet form of a maid carrying towels, daring to say what everyone else was too afraid to admit. And in that moment, he promised himself something. He would not let her courage go unnoticed. The next few days unfolded with a strange weight pressing on the CEO's mind. He had taken the maid's advice, seen the doctor, and learned the truth about his infection. But when he first told his closest associates about it, their reactions revealed just how deeply his life had been built on fragile foundations. They nodded politely, some forced a laugh, and a few even downplayed the seriousness of his condition, telling him not to worry. One even dared to say, "Sir, people like you cannot be taken down by something so small." Their words were meant to comfort, but in truth, they revealed the blindness that surrounded him. To them, he was not allowed to be human. He was only a figure of strength, a man immune to pain, a leader too powerful to stumble. At first, he almost allowed himself to believe them. Pride is a stubborn voice, and for years it had been his closest companion. He told himself that maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe the doctor was only being cautious. After all, how could a man who had survived economic storms and built an empire be threatened by something as invisible as bacteria? He wanted to laugh it off, to continue as if nothing had happened. That instinct to dismiss the truth was strong, and for a brief time he almost surrendered to it. But late at night, alone in his hotel room, he would feel the ache in his leg throb like a reminder of reality. The red patches looked worse under the dim lamplight. The words of the maid returned again and again, louder than all the polite dismissals of his colleagues. She had not sugarcoated anything. She had not tried to protect his pride. She had spoken the truth because she cared more about his life than his image. And that was what made her words impossible to forget. One evening, as he scrolled through endless emails, he paused to think about the difference between her voice and the voices of those closest to him. Everyone else seemed trapped in the illusion that he was untouchable. They were afraid to break that illusion, afraid to disturb the balance of power. But she had seen him clearly, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a man whose body was showing signs of distress. And though he had brushed her off at first, her sincerity had lodged itself in his heart like a seed that refused to die. That night he stood before the mirror. He studied his face, the lines carved deep from years of stress, the tiredness in his eyes that no amount of success could hide. Then his gaze traveled down to his leg, to the swelling that had begun to make walking painful. He touched it lightly and winced, a wave of humility washing over him. For so long he had demanded respect from others, but now he realized that respect meant little if he could not respect the truth about himself. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, and in that silence a decision grew in him. He would no longer dismiss the warnings. He would no longer hide behind pride. The maid's courage had broken through the wall of denial he had built, and now it was time to truly listen. The next morning, he returned to the doctor for further treatment, something he would never have done without her push. The diagnosis was confirmed, the medications adjusted, and the plan for his recovery laid out in careful detail. It was clear now. Ignoring it any longer could have led to disaster. The realization shook him deeply. He thought of his family, his employees, the thousands of lives connected to his decisions. What would have happened if he had simply brushed it all aside? When he returned to the hotel, his steps were slower, but his mind was clearer. He asked the manager quietly if he could speak to the maid who had cleaned his room. The request surprised the staff, as most guests of his status rarely remembered the faces of those who worked behind the scenes. But he insisted, and eventually she was brought to him, standing nervously at the doorway of his suite, her hands folded in front of her. For a moment, the CEO simply looked at her. She seemed so small in the grand room, her uniform plain, her eyes uncertain, but he knew now that she carried a strength few others possessed. He gestured for her to sit, though she hesitated, unused to being treated as anything more than invisible. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "When you first spoke to me, I brushed your words aside. I wanted to believe it was nothing. But because of you, I went to the doctor again. And you were right, it was serious. If I had ignored it, I do not know what would have happened." Her eyes widened, surprise written across her face. She had not expected acknowledgement, not from a man like him. She stammered, "I only said it because I was worried. I am glad you listened." He leaned back, shaking his head slowly. "No, you did more than that. You spoke when no one else would. Everyone around me either did not notice or did not dare to tell me the truth. You did. And because of that, you may have saved my life." Her eyes lowered, humbled by his words, but inside her heart swelled. For so long, her life had been about serving quietly, about working hard in the background without recognition. To hear that her small act of courage had made such a difference felt overwhelming. In that moment, a new understanding was born between them. He realized that wealth and titles did not give someone the monopoly on wisdom. Sometimes the greatest truth came from the humblest of places. She realized that her voice mattered, that even someone like her, often overlooked, could make a difference in the life of someone the world saw as untouchable. From then on, the CEO carried her words like a compass. Each time he felt tempted to dismiss his health, each time pride tried to silence the truth, he remembered her gentle but firm reminder. Sometimes what looks small is not small at all. It was a lesson he would never forget, a lesson that taught him that listening to the quiet voices around him could be the difference between life and death. And so, while others had dismissed the signs, while he himself had tried to ignore them, it was the courage of one maid that broke through the silence. Dismissed at first, yes, but in the end, heard more loudly than anyone else. The days that followed carried a quiet tension for the CEO. He was used to fast results in business, quick deals, immediate responses, swift decisions. But the body did not follow the rules of the boardroom. The body demanded patience, demanded humility, demanded that he sit still and let time reveal the truth. And so, while his mind screamed for control, he was forced to surrender to waiting. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic, the walls painted in pale colors meant to soothe, though they only made him feel more exposed. He had always entered medical offices with a kind of arrogance, expecting simple answers, assuming his money could buy certainty. But this time was different. This time he sat as a man stripped of his power, watching doctors move with serious expressions, feeling the weight of every minute pass like a stone pressing on his chest. He remembered the maid's words again and again, each memory mixing with the steady ache in his leg. Her quiet insistence had led him here, to this moment where machines hummed, needles pricked his skin, and professionals studied charts that revealed pieces of his hidden truth. He realized now how close he had been to disaster, how easily his pride could have cost him everything. The results arrived one gray afternoon. His doctor walked in with papers in hand, his face solemn but not hopeless. The infection had spread farther than expected. It was not simply a rash or a surface irritation. It was something deeper, something that could have become fatal had it been left alone much longer. The doctor explained that immediate and aggressive treatment was necessary. Antibiotics, rest, and constant monitoring would be required for weeks, maybe months. At first, the words left the CEO numb. He sat there staring at the charts, hearing the clinical language, yet feeling the emotional impact settle into his bones. He had always thought of himself as invincible, a man too strong to be brought down by something small. And yet here he was, facing the reality that a few more weeks of silence could have ended his life. The thought chilled him more than any financial loss ever could. That evening, back in his hotel suite, he sat in the quiet glow of a single lamp. The city outside bustled with its usual energy, but inside he felt a stillness unlike anything he had ever known. He looked at his leg, wrapped carefully in bandages, and thought of how fragile life truly was. And then he thought of the maid, a woman who worked tirelessly, unnoticed, carrying towels in cleaning rooms, yet who had seen what everyone else missed. It was her courage that had pushed him to act. Without her, he might never have sought deeper answers. Without her, the infection might have spread until it was too late. It was in that silence that he understood the true meaning of discovery. The doctors had uncovered the medical truth, but the real discovery, the one that shook him to his core, was that his life had been saved not by wealth, not by status, but by the honesty of someone the world barely noticed. The next morning, he requested to see her again. She entered the room hesitantly, her eyes lowered, unsure why a man of his stature would call for her once more. He gestured for her to sit, though she stood nervously by the door, clutching the edge of her apron. "I need you to know what has happened," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority it once did, but instead a quiet gratitude. "The doctors confirmed that what you saw was dangerous. If I had ignored it any longer, it could have cost me my life. Because you spoke, I am here. You may think your words were small, but they were not. They were everything." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry. She had never imagined that her simple observation, spoken with trembling courage, would carry such weight. She had not expected thanks. She had not expected recognition. She had only wanted to help. The CEO continued, his tone heavier with emotion. "Do you understand what that means? Everyone else around me stayed silent. My colleagues, my friends, even my doctors at first. They all missed it. But you saw, and because of that you saved me." The maid shook her head humbly. "I only did what anyone should do," she said softly. "I saw something and I spoke. That is all." But he knew it was more than that. It was not just observation. It was the courage to risk speaking to someone who could have dismissed her, someone who could have taken offense, someone whose power far outweighed her own. That was the true miracle, that she had chosen to care when it would have been easier to stay silent. The realization filled him with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Gratitude that she had been there at the right moment. Shame that he had lived so long surrounded by people too afraid to be honest. In that moment, he discovered not only the illness inside his body, but the illness inside his life, the walls of pride and power that had silenced truth. From then on, he began his treatments with a new perspective. Each pill, each doctor's visit, each careful step toward healing reminded him of the fragile thread that connected him to life. And each time he felt weary, he thought of her quiet courage, her steady eyes, her voice that had broken through his denial. The true discovery was not just medical, it was human. It was the recognition that lives can be saved not only by science but by compassion, that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not in labs or boardrooms, but in the simple act of someone daring to notice and daring to speak. And so, while the doctors worked on healing his body, it was the maid who had healed something deeper, his blindness to the truth around him. And he knew now with certainty that her discovery was the one that mattered most. The CEO had spent decades building a world where everything bent to his will. Markets shifted because of his decisions. Companies rose and fell with his investments, and people measured their worth by his approval. He was the center of control, the master of every outcome. Yet now, sitting quietly in his hotel suite, his leg bandaged and his body weakened, he realized how powerless he truly was against the fragility of life. That realization should have broken him. Instead, it began to rebuild him into someone new. For the first time in years, he slowed down. The endless meetings, the flights across continents, the celebrations of profits, all of it paused as he turned inward. His assistants were shocked when he canceled appointments. His board was confused when he delegated major decisions. But he no longer felt the same hunger to be everywhere, to control everything. The illness had stripped him of pride, and what remained was humility. And within that humility grew gratitude. He thought of the maid often. Her face, her voice, her eyes that had seen what others ignored. She became a symbol in his mind, not just of the moment that saved his life, but of everything he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. How many people like her had crossed his path carrying truths he had dismissed? How many voices had remained silent because he created an environment where speaking up was too risky? The thought unsettled him, but it also inspired him to change. One afternoon, he asked the hotel manager to bring her to his suite again. She arrived hesitantly, her steps cautious, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She expected perhaps a word of thanks, perhaps even nothing more than a polite nod. But instead, he greeted her with warmth she had never seen in him before. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said softly, "but I want you to know that your courage has changed me. You did not just save my life, you opened my eyes. You showed me what true leadership is. It is not about commanding others. It is about listening, even to the quietest voices." She tried to smile, though her humility made it difficult to accept praise. "I only did what my heart told me," she said. Anyone else would have done the same, but he shook his head. "No, that is not true. Many people saw me, yet no one spoke. You did. And because of that, I want to do something more than just say thank you." At first, she resisted. She did not want rewards. She did not want her act of compassion to be turned into a transaction. But he assured her that what he had in mind was not about repayment, it was about transformation. He explained that he wanted to start an initiative, one that would bring awareness to the importance of early medical checkups, one that would fund programs in communities where people often ignored or could not afford treatment. He wanted her to be part of it, to stand as a reminder of how one act of courage could ripple outward to save countless lives. The maid listened, her heart torn between disbelief and hope. For years, her life had been a series of quiet routines, waking early, working long hours, returning home tired but determined. She had accepted invisibility as part of her existence, yet here was a man telling her that her voice mattered, that her courage could change not only him but many others. Tears welled in her eyes, though she quickly brushed them away, unused to being seen in such a light. The CEO followed through on his promise. He used his wealth not for more towers or luxuries, but for programs that reached those who needed it most. Clinics were funded. Awareness campaigns were launched. He appeared on stages not to boast of profits, but to speak about the importance of listening to your body, to those around you, to the small signs that so often go ignored. And every time he spoke, he told the story of the maid who had saved him. The world listened with surprise. Journalists wrote articles about the transformation of a man once known only for his ruthless business tactics. Employees whispered about how he had become softer, more approachable, more human. Investors wondered if this new side of him would weaken his empire. But what they did not see was that his new strength came not from power, but from vulnerability. For the first time, he was leading not with pride, but with gratitude. As for the maid, her life changed too. She did not ask for recognition, but it came anyway. People in the hotel began to look at her differently. Guests who once walked past her without notice now greeted her warmly. Colleagues who had once seen her as just another worker now admired her courage. Yet through it all, she remained the same, humble, hardworking, guided by the same compassion that had moved her to speak up in the first place. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw herself as invisible. She realized that her life, though simple, carried a power she had never acknowledged. She understood now that courage was not about titles or wealth. It was about caring enough to act, even when fear whispered to stay silent. That understanding gave her a quiet confidence she carried into every part of her life. The CEO and the maid did not become close friends, nor did their lives intertwine beyond the story that bound them. But each carried the other's impact forever. He carried her courage as a reminder that leadership begins with listening. She carried his gratitude as proof that even the smallest voice can echo in the grandest halls. In the end, gratitude transformed them both. It turned a powerful man into a humble one. It turned an invisible woman into a symbol of courage. And it created a legacy that went far beyond the walls of a hotel or the confines of wealth. The CEO once believed success was measured in profits. Now he knew it was measured in lives touched. The maid once believed her work left no mark. Now she knew her voice could save. And together, without ever planning it, they had woven a story of transformation that reminded the world of a simple truth. Greatness is not about what you have, but about what you give. Time moved forward as it always does, carrying both the memory of the past and the quiet unfolding of the future. The CEO's body healed slowly, and though he returned to business, he never returned to who he had been before. The infection that nearly claimed him had left no visible scar, but it had carved something much deeper inside, a reminder that even the strongest can break and that even the smallest act can save. He often thought about how close he had come to silence, how easily his story could have ended in a sterile hospital room, another headline about a powerful man lost too soon. And he thought about the maid, about how her decision to speak when it would have been easier to stay quiet had changed everything. He carried her courage like a compass, letting it guide his choices. Where once he would have brushed past voices he deemed unimportant, he now listened more carefully. Where once he had filled rooms with his own certainty, he now allowed space for others to speak. The changes did not go unnoticed. In his company, employees began to see a different kind of leader. The man who had once been feared for his ruthlessness now became respected for his openness. He still demanded excellence, but he no longer demanded silence. He encouraged his teams to raise concerns, to share ideas, to notice the small details others might ignore. And slowly the culture shifted. People no longer worked with fear in their hearts, but with a sense that their voices mattered. Beyond his company, his story spread further than he expected. Newspapers and magazines picked it up, not because of the infection, but because of the transformation. They wrote about the CEO who credited a maid with saving his life. Some framed it as unusual, others as inspirational, but in every telling, the message was clear. Status and wealth cannot replace the power of compassion. The maid herself was uncomfortable with the attention at first. She had never wanted the spotlight. She had never imagined her name would appear in articles, or that people would stop her in the hotel corridors to thank her for what she had done. She always answered humbly, saying she had only done what anyone would have done. But deep down, she knew the truth. Not everyone would have spoken. Many would have stayed silent, afraid of consequences, unwilling to risk. Her choice to act had been small in the moment, but its ripple reached far beyond what she could see. In her own community, people began to look at her differently. Neighbors who once overlooked her now saw her as an example of courage. Young people especially listened when she spoke, inspired by the story of how a woman who cleaned rooms for a living had saved a life that money alone could not protect. She did not become rich, she did not seek fame, but she gained something she valued more, respect that was rooted in truth. Years later, when she looked back on that moment in the hotel room, she still felt the same tremor in her chest that she had felt when she first spoke to him. Fear had been real that day. She had feared losing her job, feared being dismissed, feared stepping out of the invisible role she had been placed in. But she had also felt something stronger than fear, compassion. And compassion had guided her words. That choice reminded her again and again that courage does not erase fear. It simply chooses to act in spite of it. The CEO never forgot her either. Whenever he stood on stages to speak about health awareness, whenever he signed another check to fund clinics in struggling neighborhoods, he spoke of her. He never told her story for applause. He told it because it humbled him, because it reminded him that power is empty without humanity, and because it proved that no life is too small to make a difference. He told her story to teach others that the people often overlooked are the ones who carry truths worth listening to. And so, the legacy of that one small act spread wider than either of them had expected. It reached boardrooms and classrooms, hospitals and homes. It inspired other workers to speak up when they noticed something wrong, even if they feared being ignored. It encouraged leaders to listen more carefully, to see beyond titles and appearances, and it reminded countless people that kindness, even when it feels insignificant, can shift the course of lives. In the end, the CEO continued to thrive, but his definition of success had changed forever. It was no longer measured in profits or influence, but in lives touched, in voices heard, in compassion shown. The maid continued her work, still tying her apron each morning and pushing her cart down hotel hallways. But she did it with a quiet confidence that she had once lacked. She no longer believed she was invisible. She knew her presence mattered, her eyes mattered, her words mattered. The story of the maid and the millionaire was not about wealth or power. It was about humanity. It was about how a single moment of courage could bridge the gap between two very different lives and create a legacy that would outlive them both. Years from now, long after the details faded and the names were forgotten, the lesson remained timeless. That greatness is not built only in towers of glass or numbers on a screen. True greatness can begin with something as simple as noticing, as caring, as daring to speak when silence would be easier. And so the world remembered, not just the man who almost lost everything, but the woman who saved him with nothing more than her voice. Her act was small in the eyes of the world, but in truth it was immeasurable, because sometimes the smallest acts leave the largest legacies.